She was with us just a few weeks ago, Evelyn Brown's sister Dee, and I prayed with her in the foyer back there. She was facing surgery issues with her heart, and as they did the surgery, they found out her heart was very small and her veins were all very small, and she made it through the surgery, but there were complications, and in her weakened state, she passed away. She always talked about how much she loved being here. She lived in Texas. She loved being here. And she even said that she loved my preaching. And then Friday, I visited with one of our longest and oldest members, Amos Hunter. He was in the hospital. His breathing was labored, but he woke up and he talked to me, and he was struggling and suffering, and you could tell he was. And Amos went on to be with the Lord. And we will celebrate his life Wednesday at 1 o'clock. But I have been in the ministry a long time, and I've seen a lot of suffering. How many of you have seen a lot of suffering in your life? It's very real. And I want to tell you, a third of all the Psalms aren't praise, they're lament. Because life has its challenges. You're familiar with our story of a couple of years ago, and I hate to bore you with it again, but it's very real to us. Angela Mills' father had passed away several years ago. It was hard to see a man who was a major in the Army, a man who had his own business, who was a leader in town. Hard to see him suffering a debilitating stroke and not be able to speak and had to have help. It was hard to see that. But it was harder to see him pass on and leave behind his wife. And so we were trying to help care for Angela Mills' mom, who had a lung disease and was failing. And in the midst of all that, my mom got diagnosed with a lung disease, never smoked a day in her life. And it was a cruel disease. It basically turned the inside of her lungs into spider webs. And over time, she would lose most of the capacity of her lungs. And so we heard that diagnosis around 2009, and I can remember coming down to visit her and driving home and weeping for 90 miles, knowing that my mom is so beautiful, so young, and one of the most godly ladies I've ever known in my life, knowing that she was going to die. Kind of rocked my world. You've been there. I know you've been there. And when you know it, the Lord called us to come here to this church. And so we were closer. And the doctor gave Mom 6 months to live. And she got mad at him. She said, "That's not up to you, it's up to God." And she decided to live another 7 years. But they were not easy. And there were times when her feet were black because she couldn't get oxygen to her feet. Her hands would be purple. And as her body starved for oxygen, she would cough without control. It was her body's natural way of trying to get oxygen into her blood. She'd cough so much that she would lose her dinner. And she would be up all night long. It was hard to see that. And yet she would get up every day. She would put up on her makeup. She would never, hardly ever wear a bathrobe. She would always make sure she was dressed. And she would try to get out every day. She never missed a Sunday of church until the very end, as she went and ministered. And she sang up until the last few weeks of her life. I don't know how she sang, because she couldn't breathe, but she sang. In the meantime, Angela Mills' mom moved in with us, and she had a hard time getting around, and Angela Mills was taking care of her day in and day out, and we were preparing for Ken to go off to college. Some of you have experienced that. That's no fun either, is it? And so in July, we finally got to go on vacation. We were exhausted, and the very night that we got to the vacation spot, we got a phone call that Mom had died. I knew she was sick, but it caught me by total surprise that she passed away that night. How many of you have ever been away from somebody that passed away and you just felt that guilt that you weren't there? Well, I tell you what, that was a long night of despair. And I had to drive back from the beach to West Virginia. My brother would stop by my house and pick up us clothes, and I preached my mama's funeral. And then just 2 months later, my mother-in-law passed away at our home, and I don't know that's much better being there than it is being apart. And together we mourned and we grieved and preached her funeral. At my mom's funeral, my grandmother was there. My grandmother was racked with arthritis. She's one of the most amazing people you would ever know. Just full of love for the Lord, sweet and kind, and an amazing cook. She's the kind of lady at Thanksgiving that has everybody's favorite on the table, and when it's all done, she doesn't say, help do the dishes. She says, you go take a nap. I'll do this. She sat there beside my daughter Hannah in a chair at the funeral home, and she cried. It was the second daughter-in-law she had buried in the past couple months, and she had to say goodbye to her grandson just a couple years earlier. And she said, this isn't fair. She passed away a day after her 73rd anniversary. And we made another trip back to West Virginia. And I spent my birthday at the funeral home, my 50th birthday, and I preached her funeral. In the midst of all that, I had a heart attack. How many of you know that sometimes life just stinks? And it hurts. It's painful. You know, too often we don't prepare ourselves for those times in life. Those times which will inevitably come. And sometimes in those times is when we are the most vulnerable to the lies of Satan. And we believe all kinds of things that are absolutely not true. I want us to take today, as we are in this service and as you are in community groups, and as you go through that chapter 4 of Overcome, I want God to get truth into your life so that when the difficult times come, we may not only endure, but we may prosper. And so open up your Bible to the book of Romans. And let me share something that Paul gives to all of us, which I absolutely love and celebrate today. Again, in sharing my story with you, I don't want to bore you with that. I know you know it. But I do want to say this. I've learned a few things through it. And one of the greatest things that I've learned is found here in Romans 8:18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. Today, let me just give you some truths. Truth number 1 is everyone suffers sometime. Please write that down. This is a truth that Paul just gives us in verse 19. Creation waits with expectation. Why? Because creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice. You see, Adam and Eve sinned, and they brought pain and suffering on all of creation. And so everybody, everything suffers sometime. It is a lie that the righteous should not or do not suffer. I have heard either misintentioned or misled preachers and theologians say that if you just have enough faith, you will never suffer. If you just have enough faith, you will never get sick. I have never known a person in my life with more faith than my mother. My mother could put a faith healer's faith to bed. And yet, in the midst of all her faith, I saw her suffer with this question: what did I do wrong? That was extremely painful for a woman who had raised her children. We never heard a cross word. A woman who served beside her husband and served faithfully and counseled innumerable people, who spent her time on her knees, who loved the Lord with all of her heart, soul, mind, and strength. What did she do wrong to deserve what she suffered with? The answer is nothing. In the middle of the Old Testament is a curious book with just a 3-letter name, Job. That book is there for a reason, and it's hard to figure it out. You have the story of Job, and you might be familiar. God says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? He's showing off a little bit. And Satan says the only reason he still praises you is because he's got all the stuff that you've blessed him with. God said you can take it away. He took it away. Took away his family. Took away his possessions. And Job still praised the Lord. And he said, the only reason he's still praising you is because you haven't let me touch him. God says you can't kill him, but you can touch him. And Job was extremely ill and in agonizing pain, and there was no morphine in the day. And yet he praised God. But in the meantime, he had 3 friends, or at least he thought they were friends. And they show up, and for like 30 chapters, they tell him, Job, you've done something wrong to deserve this. In other words, they were teaching the doctrine of karma. There is no karma. If you believe in karma, you believe in something that is unbiblical. They were saying, you've done something wrong. What goes around comes around. You deserve this somehow. You need to confess it, admit it, and deal with it so that you can get on past it. Job says, I don't know what I've done. I haven't done anything. He wasn't being self-righteous. He was just telling the truth. And they kept going on and on and on. You've done something. And this is the wisdom. And their wisdom was wrong. And God answers their wisdom at the end and says, I'm going to smack you down, boys. And Job had to pray for his friends, and they repented, and God relented from his anger against them for their lack of wisdom. We need to understand today there is no such thing as karma. Righteous people can suffer just as much as unrighteous people. Now, I will say there's a principle of sowing and reaping. If you drink like a fish, you probably will end up with cirrhosis of the liver. That's self-inflicted. If you live like a heathen, you're probably going to have problems. If you spend unwisely, you're probably going to be broke. These are principles of sowing and reaping. But we find that even the righteous will suffer. It's hard to see it, but it's true. The Bible tells us it rains on the just and the unjust. That's blessings. Even unrighteous people have blessings. But in the same way, righteous people suffer. Now, understand this. Whenever somebody's going through a difficult time, it is not God's judgment upon them. Necessarily. It is sometimes we don't see the rest of the story. Remember the beginning of the book of Job? God says to Satan, have you seen and considered my servant Job? Job never knew that part of the story. I've seen people here. Keith, for example, who ran his race and finished with so much suffering and gave God so much glory that I'm sure God was saying to Satan, have you seen my servant Keith? And all of heaven's applauding for how well he finished his race. We run our race with endurance. We fight the good fight. Paul says himself, I am being poured out as a drink offering. Why? Because everyone sooner or later suffers. Now let me just give you this side note right here. Many of us try to keep our children from pain. It is a natural thing to try to protect your children. Oh, we don't need to take Johnny to the funeral home. He's 10 years old. He's too young to experience that. Let me just tell you right now, my pastoral training did not come in seminary. My pastoral training came at Camden Clark Memorial Hospital and Levitt's Funeral Home. As I went with my family and I visited people and I was there at funerals when we wept with people. I'm going to tell you, if you want your children to try to avoid pain later, they will figure out a way to avoid pain. And it will typically be drugs, alcohol, addiction, or some sort of ungodly way. Right now, you need to teach your children to deal with suffering because it's going to happen in their lives sooner or later. And you can equip them, especially by paying attention to what we're talking about today. Pain will come. It will come to everyone at some time. Sometimes it's physical. Sometimes it's mental. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's even spiritual. Sometimes it's financial. And sometimes it's relational, but it will come. Paul's writing about himself here. Paul experienced so much pain. You've heard me say it before. Do you realize he was beaten with rods? The maximum amount of beatings you can get without being killed. Do you realize he was whipped with a whip similar to what Jesus was whipped with? Do you realize he was stoned and left for dead? They thought he was dead. He was shipwrecked, he was bitten with snakes, and he was chained in the coldest and darkest of dungeons. And yet he says, I consider these sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory which will be revealed. Paul knew what he was talking about. There's a second thing that I want you to understand today, and it's this. God is not the author of suffering. As a matter of fact, I think it's so important you and I need to say this together. God is not the author of suffering. I've read this book. As a matter of fact, if you don't have to read very far to see how God created things. When he created this world, it was beautiful. It was perfect. In the Garden of Eden, man had perfect fellowship with God and with each other. And every need was supplied. There was no sickness. There was no pain. There was no death. There were no tears. There were no sorrow. There was no suffering. And yet in the sin and in the fall, just as Paul tells us earlier, creation, it was subjected because of man's sin. We see in 1 Corinthians 14:33, God is not the author of disorder. He is not the author of these things that are mess. He is the one who created it perfect, and man messed it up in his sin. I want you to get that again. Man messed it up in his sin. Say it again. Man messed it up in his sin. Now, this didn't catch God by surprise, but yet again, we understand that God is not the one who is accountable for our sufferings. We messed up. When the serpent came to Eve and he said, "You shall know the difference between good and evil," she sure enough knew evil real soon. Not only did she find herself naked and ashamed, she was clothed with fig leaves at first, which could have been a little uncomfortable. And then the skin of a slain animal, how horrific that must have been. But her pain only grew as she sees one son murder another. Suffering came quickly as Adam and Eve knew good and evil. That was not God's design. But it does lead us to this third point. God is with us even through suffering. God is with us even through suffering. I want you to get this. We've preached through the 23rd Psalm, and we talked about the importance of understanding that even when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what? God is with us. Even his rod and staff bring us comfort. We must understand today that Matthew 28:20 says, "Teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age." We see that Jesus not only is with us, but he sends his Holy Spirit, whom he calls the Comforter, who will lead us and guide us through difficult times. And so we are not alone. Sometimes we feel that way, don't we? Sometimes we feel like God has abandoned us. We simply need to turn around and recognize that he's there. God is with us. He says he will never leave us or forsake us. If we make our bed in the pit of hell, it says, "Behold, you are with me." If I take the wings of dawn and fly even to the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, your right hand will hold me. God is with us in the suffering. I was amazed by this. As we said, 2016 was just a terrible year. But it was a time whenever we sensed the presence of God more real than any time before. We laughed in 2016. We laughed at the funeral home. We laughed with friends. We laughed at Facebook posts. We enjoyed meals. We enjoyed our families. In the midst of all that was going on, we sensed the very presence of God. And I'm going to tell you, we sensed the blessing of being part of a church that loves the Lord and loves each other. Because you were such a sense of encouragement, such a source of encouragement and strength for us during that time, that through your blessings, we could sense the very presence of God. And so everyone suffers sometimes, and we understand that God is not the author of suffering, but we also understand that God is with us in the suffering. And not only is God with us, but he understands our suffering. God understands our suffering. Have you ever had that friend that sat down beside you and knows exactly what you're going through? Some of you ladies who lost a husband, do you know that friend who sat down and says, "I know exactly what you're going through"? Somebody that also had lost a job or been laid off, who comes along beside you and said, it's going to be okay. I know what you're going through. Somebody that's going through marital problems, who sits down and says, I understand your struggle. I know what you're going through. Somebody, when you hear the diagnosis of cancer, comes to you as a survivor and says, I'll walk with you. I'll help you get through this. How valuable is that? Listen to me. We have a God who understands what we're going through. You say, how can it be? He's God. Never forget that Jesus Christ was fully God, but he was also fully man. I don't know. Is it unholy to think that Jesus at times may have had a stomach ache? He had to have had a stomach ache. They didn't have refrigeration back then. Think about it. Did he ever stub his toe? He stubbed his toe, and by the way, he didn't cuss when he did it. Did he ever have his feelings hurt? I'm sure he had his feelings hurt. But if nothing else, we can look at how his life ended with betrayal. His life ended with his friends leaving his side. His life ended with a brutal beating, with his beard being plucked out, with people mocking him and spitting at him. He ended his life with a terrible beating that would have killed most people, and by carrying a cross up a hill and having nails put in his hands and his feet and hanging there until he suffocated. We have a God who understands our suffering. Absolutely. Listen to what Hebrews 4:15 says. We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Don't you imagine, as Paul is receiving his lashes, he understands that his God knows what he's going through? Don't you think he heard this word, and yes, you are willing to suffer with me? With means I've suffered, you suffer with me. Right now, my wife's been going through a challenging time, cleaning out Mama's house, box after box of memories, precious memories. And every once in a while, one will bring a tear to our eyes, realizing that that's gone. That part is over. And yet we're reminded of the shortest verse in the Bible. You all know what it is. Say it with me. Jesus wept. Isaiah 53:3 calls him a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. The great old hymn says, Jesus knows all about our troubles, and he does. There is not a friend like the lowly Jesus. No, not one. No, not one. When you're going through a hard time, you're reminded again that we have a high priest. That means he is a mediator. That means he can go to God on our behalf and says, I know what they're going through. Give them strength. Give them peace. Finally, this is extremely important to understand. God has a purpose for our suffering. I said finally, I lied. It's not final. And so your suffering will endure for another 5 minutes or so. God has a purpose for our suffering. You see, God is not the author of suffering, but yet God allows our suffering. I want you to get that. God is not the author of our suffering, but yet God allows it. And the ultimate reason he allows it is because ultimately he can use something bad and turn it for good. That's what the Bible teaches us. God can take something bad and turn it for good. You remember Joseph was thrown in a pit by his brothers. They sold him into slavery into Egypt. When they come back and they finally understand that he's the second most powerful guy in Egypt, they're afraid he's going to kill him. He says, no, what you meant for bad, God took and used for good. And it ended up saving his whole family. And they all came into Egypt and were fed. Isn't it amazing that God can take bad things and use them for good? That's why James says in James 1:2, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kind, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. I don't know about you, but when I went to school back in the day, there were tests. How many of you remember? I still have bad dreams about tests. I have that one class that I forget where it was. And somebody said, did you study for the test? And I said, test? What test? And so I'm cramming and I'm walking, but I can't find the class because I've never been there before. How many of you have had that dream? That dream is only partially based in reality for me. Only partially. It is the test that made me get better. It is preparing for the test, going through the test, having the evaluation of the test that lets me see where I need to grow, where I need to strengthen, where I need to learn. That's what James is saying here. And so he says, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature, complete, not lacking anything. For if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe with not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave in the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded, unstable in all his ways. And so we ask, Lord, help me grow. And you know what the Lord will send us at times? Tests. I guarantee you today, if I walked into the doctor's office and said, I want to get buff, I want to lose weight, he would take me to the gym. That's why I don't go to the doctor's office and say I want to get buff and lose weight, because I would have to go through the tests. You know, Tertullian said of the church, the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church. Christianity became the largest religion in the world. It took over the Roman Empire. Why? Because people were willing to suffer for Christ, knowing that he had a greater purpose. My mom's sickness, they gave her 6 months, as I mentioned, and so we were trying to encourage her to keep moving forward, and we tried to encourage her to have something to live for. And so we scheduled a concert at Dad's church. It was over in Madison at the time. And we came down from Glasgow, Kentucky, and the title of the concert was One More Song, One More Time. And our family was going to sing. Mom was going to sing one more time. We're trying to push her to keep singing. And we invited friends and family members to do a big concert. And one of the members of our church was there and saw us at that concert. And I'm not going to tell you her name because I don't want you egging her house or giving her bad phone calls, but she's kind of responsible for me being here. And so what I'm telling you is this: God used my mother's sickness to bring us from Glasgow, Kentucky, where we were settled and safe, and bring us here where we've been so blessed to be in this partnership of ministry with you. Do you see what God does sometimes? He uses these things. I can't tell you how many people were touched by my mom's lives. They would go to Panera almost every day, and they had a whole bunch of friends who would come in and say, would you pray for such and such who's going through a sickness? And their lives influenced so many. And I watched and I learned. Listen, today, I'm going to tell you, I'm a better pastor than I was 2 years ago. I understand suffering more than I did. My preaching may not be good, but it's better. And I understand these things deeper, and I embrace these truths. Today, understand this: God has a purpose when you go through suffering, and it's a good purpose. And we're reminded that all things work together for the good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Now, finally, are you ready? Finally, I mean it this time. I'm not lying. Listen to this. God will put an end to our suffering. I joke about kidney stones. I joke about that pain. And I joke about my favorite scripture verse through kidney stones, and it's this too shall pass. Oh, my Lord. When that kidney stone finally drops out of that little tube that runs from your kidney to your bladder, oh, thank God. Because that hurts. Ladies, they say it hurts like contractions, except it's a contraction that doesn't stop. I don't know about giving birth to a baby, but if it feels anything like a kidney stone, I'm sorry, honey, I'm really sorry. And you really need to go home and apologize to Kelly. Listen to this, Revelation 21. I love this. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, no more mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." You can imagine my surprise when I went Friday to district competition and watched my daughter perform in different things. And she gets it from her mama. She's a very talented young lady. She was performing a duo acting with a young man, and I didn't know what it was going to be. She wouldn't tell me what it was. And come to find out, he was portraying C.S. Lewis, and she was portraying a young lady named Joy who met C.S. Lewis. And in the midst of all this, her husband leaves her for another woman, and she ends up moving to England to be able to study. And out of pity on her, C.S. Lewis marries her. And he says, it wasn't a spiritual marriage. I just married her legally so she could come over and live in Britain. And he starts off his conversation with the crowd by saying, "I remember teaching my classes and approaching the subject like I had so much wisdom." And he would ask the students to explain suffering. And he'd say, "I would go through my biblical answers with the precision of a philosopher. And yet I did not know." Joy, whose husband had left her for another woman, who was all alone in England, found out that she had cancer. And this is in a day when that had little hope of survival. It was a bone cancer, and she broke a bone, and she went through surgery. And in the meantime, he really falls in love with her and wants to spiritually marry her. They go off on a honeymoon. They're so happy. But she knows she's dying. And she's in pain. And he's in great pain, watching this one whom he loves so much suffer. And sure enough, she dies. And he comes back before the audience and he says, "I used to think I knew all the answers, but now I know one thing. The suffering here makes there so much sweeter. The suffering here makes there so much sweeter." I prayed with Emmis. I asked the Lord to bring healing and ease to his suffering, but I also acknowledged that God's got a plan beyond that. I acknowledge that God's got a beautiful place where there's no more sorrow, no more sickness, no more pain, no more death, and where a man like Emmis is reunited with his good friend, Brother Joe, reunited with his wife, and hears the applause of heaven and the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I'll never forget, I've told you about him before, but his memory is just indelibly placed on my life as an example. His name was Joe Lee. He was an elder at the church in Glasgow. He was Cherokee Indian background and had the sweetest personality. And I finally talked him into serving as an elder. He had served an elder in times past, and some things went awry, and it wasn't a good experience. About the time he became an elder, he found out that he had cancer. We were in the process of praying about building a new sanctuary and a new campus. And Joe was right there in that whole process. As a matter of fact, he gave towards that process. He was excited. He wanted to see the plans for the church. And you know what he was doing every day? He was retired. Every day he was out visiting people in the church. And I saw him get sicker and sicker and weaker and weaker. And he would be at church, and he would leave the service to go throw up and come back in because of the chemotherapy. And literally, the week that he died, he was out visiting people who had cancer and praying with them and bringing them comfort. And on his tombstone was a picture of that church there in Glasgow. It's a picture from the plans because the church hadn't been built, but yet that's what he wanted on his tomb, because he was working so that other people might know Jesus Christ. I cannot imagine the suffering that he went through. And yet I cannot imagine the glory that was revealed when he stepped through the other side into heaven. When you're going through trouble, when you are suffering, know this: we will all suffer. That's not God's design. Know that he is with you. Know that he understands you. Know that he'll take it and work it all together for good. But know this: there'll be a day when all suffering is put to death, and he will wipe every tear from our eyes. And this too shall pass.